Section 13 of the Watergate Report, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Final Report of the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities, Volume 3. Chapter 8, The Hughes-Rebozo Investigation and Related Matters, Part 6. E. The Federal Reserve Evidence compared to the sources and the deliveries. 1. The mechanics of tracing the $100,100. Federal Reserve record keeping. Each $100 Federal Reserve note, hereafter note, has a series number, 1928, 1950, and so forth, and a serial number, which together make the note unique. Serial numbers are often repeated in different series, however. The money Chester Davis produced for the Select Committee on December 4, 1973, contained notes from several series, beginning in 1928. Federal Reserve records on the earlier series are almost non-existent, but the Federal Reserve assured the Select Committee that the notes from those series would have been in circulation well before the relevant 1960-70 time period. Consequently, subpoenas were issued only for notes in two later series, represented in the $100,100, the 1963A series and the 1969 series. Federal Reserve notes go through several steps before reaching commercial customers, as shown on Chart A below. Chart A. Distribution of Federal Reserve notes. Step 1. A. Printed in Washington by Bureau of Engraving and Printing. B. Sent to agents' representatives at Federal Reserve banks around the country. Step 2. Transferred by the agent's representatives to the Federal Reserve Bank's cash departments upon demand by the cash departments. Step 3. Shipped from the Federal Reserve Bank's cash departments to commercial banks upon demand by the commercial banks. End of Chart A. For the notes on which the Select Committee subpoenaed information, except non-traceable star notes, the Federal Reserve supplied the dates of Step 1 and Step 2 in the distribution process from detailed records maintained by the Federal Reserve agents' representatives. The record keeping for Step 3 was inadequate, however, despite a Federal Reserve regulation that requires the maintenance of complete records. At the time packages of new $100 notes are shipped from a Federal Reserve bank to a commercial bank, personnel in the cash department of the Federal Reserve Bank are required to record the beginning and ending serial numbers marked on each package of notes. However, cash department records often fail to show serial numbers. Therefore, not every 1963A or 1969 note can be traced to a particular commercial bank on a particular date. The poor record keeping was most unfortunate in the San Francisco Federal Reserve Bank and its branch offices, especially Los Angeles. Approximately 60% of the notes returned and identified as the first delivery and 50% of the notes returned and identified as the second delivery passed through San Francisco or one of its branches, but because of failure to record serial numbers, less than half of those notes could be traced to commercial banks. In the materials that follow, those notes that have as their latest distribution date the date of Step 2 above are notes for which no date of commercial shipment is available. The search for records. Records showing Steps 1 and 2 in Chart A are kept in numerical order by series, thus making possible almost instant retrieval of information on a given note. Records of commercial shipment, Step 3 in Chart A, are filed by date only, not by denomination, series, or serial number. In addition, notes of a particular denomination and series are not so regularly distributed in numerical order as in Steps 1 and 2. Consequently, Federal Reserve personnel who searched for commercial shipment information on a particular note had to look at every commercial shipment form from the date of Step 2 until the serial number was found, or if none were found, up to the present. When a form recording the correct serial number was found, the search was not necessarily over, for in most Federal Reserve banks the shipment forms show only serial numbers, not series numbers. If the lapse of time between Step 2 and Step 3 was great, for example over 1 year, the strong possibility existed that the serial number on the commercial shipment form was for a note from a different series. An example from one of the notes Rebozo returned and identified as the first delivery follows. Series 1963A, serial number L02935-922A. Step 2, date released to Federal Reserve Bank, March 24, 1969. Step 3, commercial shipment date, April 19, 1971. The above information was submitted to the Select Committee by the Los Angeles branch of the San Francisco Federal Reserve Bank. If true, it would contradict Rebozo's testimony that he returned the same money he received. No one has ever claimed that a delivery was made as late as 1971, so this note would have been inserted in one of the packets of money after Rebozo received it. The 2-year lapse between Steps 2 and 3 seemed inordinately long to the Select Committee staff, so the Federal Reserve was asked to check its records for the same serial number in the 1969 series. The officials in Los Angeles quickly discovered that a $100 note in the 1969 series, with a serial number identical to the 1963A note, was released to the Los Angeles branch, Step 2, on March 15, 1971, about 1 month before the commercial shipment date of April 19. No definite statement can be made about which of the notes was recorded on the April 19 form, but the likelihood, according to Federal Reserve officials, is that the commercial shipment form is for the 1969 note, which was released to the Federal Reserve Bank much closer to April 19 than was the 1963A note in which the Select Committee was interested. The San Francisco Reserve Bank and its Los Angeles branch provided incorrect information to the Select Committee of the kind described above on some 17 notes. In each case, if the date originally given as the commercial shipment date for the note subpoenaed had been correct, then Rebozo's testimony that he returned the same money he received would have been clearly contradicted. The double checking of the dates, as described above, was done by the Federal Reserve at the Select Committee's request. It should have been done by the Federal Reserve as a matter of course. 2. Some general facts about the money Rebozo returned. A. The 1001 Federal Reserve notes were distributed among the country's 12 Federal Reserve banks after they were printed by the Bureau of Engraving and Printing. About 60% of the notes in the first delivery and 50% in the second delivery went to San Francisco or one of its branch banks, primarily the Los Angeles branch. B. There are very few records of commercial shipment available from Federal Reserve banks other than San Francisco. C. Because the San Francisco Bank and its branches have more records of commercial shipment available, and because so many of the notes pass through those banks, especially Los Angeles, their records of commercial distribution have been analyzed in detail. The lopsided preponderance of notes that went to Las Vegas commercial banks in both packets of money Rebozo returned suggests that a sizable portion of the returned money was put together in Las Vegas. Most of the Las Vegas notes went to the bank that was, during 1968 to 1970, used by the Hughes-owned hotels for supplying their casinos with cash. D. The money identified and returned as the first delivery contains notes ranging from the 1934 series through the 1963A series. No commercial shipment information is available on any notes before the 1963A series. Most of the pre-1963A notes were released to Federal Reserve banks in the mid-60s, a few as late as the end of 1967. The 1963A notes on which records were found were available for commercial distribution from late 1967 through June 12, 1969. The latest date of commercial distribution is June 12, 1969, when 3 $100 notes identified and returned as part of the first delivery were released to the cash department of the Los Angeles Federal Reserve Bank by the agent's representative. No record of commercial shipment was found for this note. E. The money returned as the second delivery contains notes ranging from the 1928 series through the 1969 series. About 3/4 are from the 1963A and 1969 series. Notes from those series on which records were found went into commercial distribution from early 1967 through October 1, 1970. The latest date of commercial distribution is October 1, 1970, when a $100 note identified as part of the first delivery was released from the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago to the Lakeview Trust and Savings Bank, Chicago. The next note closest to October 1st is September 23, 1970, when a $100 note was shipped from the Los Angeles Federal Reserve branch office to the Nevada National Bank, 4th and Bridger, Las Vegas. There are some 33 additional notes that were not available for commercial distribution until late August or early September 1970. Therefore, there were 35 notes not available for commercial distribution until after August 19th and 20th, 1970. F. The money Chester Davis made available to the Select Committee on December 4, 1973, was the money returned to Hughes in June 1973. According to Danner, each delivery to Rebozo consisted of 10 packages of $5,000 each, the standard size of $100 bill packages. The money Chester Davis produced was divided into 5 packages per delivery, not 10. The 5 packages described as the second delivery contained 100 notes each. The first delivery packages, however, were uneven, ranging from 50 notes in one package to 150 in another. The extra note in the 1,001 notes was in one of the first delivery packages. How it got there has never been explained. 3. The matching numbers. Comparing the serial numbers of the bills in the first delivery with those of the bills in the second delivery produced 2 examples of a phenomenon that substantially contradicts Rebozo's story that he kept the 2 deliveries separated in the safe deposit box and did not disturb either of them until the withdrawal in 1973. In the 2 examples charted below, the bills traveled through the Federal Reserve together and, as indicated on the chart, were shipped to the same commercial bank in the same package of money on the same day. That is, the dates and places described in steps 1, 2, and 3 in the distribution system described earlier matched one another. However, the matching bills appear in different packages of the money Rebozo returned, one in the package identified as the first delivery and one in the second delivery. The 2 deliveries were apparently packaged on separate dates from 8 months to almost 2 years apart, as the preceding discussions noted. They were either put together from different sources in Las Vegas, the Sands and the Silver Slipper, or, according to Mayhew, in different cities, one delivery in Las Vegas, one in Los Angeles. According to a professional economist who analyzed their circumstances, the likelihood that the matching bills would end up coincidentally in separate deliveries that were kept segregated is highly remote, verging on 0. The evidence on the matching numbers is summarized in Exhibit A below. Backup documents supporting these dates are in the Select Committee's possession. There are several other pairs of what could be matching notes on which the Federal Reserve evidence is incomplete, That is, there are no records of commercial shipment for these notes. Each of the incomplete sets went through steps 1 and 2 in the distribution system on the same dates. However, without the records for step 3, no conclusions can be drawn about whether these notes matched completely, as in the 2 examples discussed above. Exhibit A. Matching numbers. Delivery, as identified by Rebozo. First delivery, first note, Series 1963A, serial number L022-85857A. Second note, Series 1963A, serial number L022-87969A. Date of commercial shipment for both, December 4th, 1968, from Los Angeles Federal Reserve to Nevada National Bank, 4th and Bridger, Las Vegas. Delivery, as identified by Rebozo. Second delivery, first note, 1963A, serial number L032482554A. Second delivery, second note, Series 1963A, serial number L0324881A. Date of commercial shipment for both, May 21, 1969, from Los Angeles Federal Reserve to Sunrise Branch, Bank of Las Vegas, Las Vegas. 4. The facts compared with possible sources of the deliveries. The Select Committee has received evidence and testimony pointing to 4 possible sources of funds for the deliveries. If either of the first 2 sources, both in early December 1968, was a source for a delivery, evidence produced by the Federal Reserve shows that the money returned by Rebozo was not kept intact from December 1968 until its return in 1973. The third source, Nadine Henley, mid-1969, is doubtful, if the money remained intact at all times, because of where it originated, Los Angeles. Most of the money the Federal Reserve was able to trace went to Las Vegas commercial banks, not Los Angeles. The Federal Reserve evidence on the fourth source, the Silver Slipper, on October 26, 1970, does not contradict the testimony that the money was kept intact from origin to return. The discussion of Federal Reserve evidence on sources for the deliveries should be read as an introduction to the following section on delivery dates. For a full understanding of the significance of the Federal Reserve evidence is possible only when the all-important delivery dates are considered. Las Vegas, Sands Hotel, early December 1968. If this was the source of the first delivery, all the money Rebozo returned as the first delivery could not have come from the Sands. There are 88 notes in the money returned and identified as the first delivery that were not available for commercial distribution until after the Sands withdrawal, and therefore would have been put into the $50,000 at a later date or later dates. The latest notes were released to the Los Angeles Federal Reserve Bank on June 12, 1969, some 7 months after the Sands withdrawal. If this withdrawal was the source of the second delivery, most of the notes Rebozo identified as that delivery were not in circulation until well after that Sands withdrawal. The notes that went into circulation after the Sands withdrawal show that the money Rebozo returned could not be the exact money obtained in December 1968. There are 3 possible explanations. A. The money did not stay intact from the time of withdrawal by Hughes's agents to the time of delivery to Rebozo. B. It did not stay intact after Rebozo received it. Or C. Some combination of A and B. Los Angeles, Bank of America, December 5, 1968. Sent to Robert Mayhew by Nadine Henley on December 5 and 6, 1968, in 2 $25,000 installments. As with the Sands withdrawal of the same date, there are 88 notes in the money identified as the first delivery that were not in commercial circulation until after that money was obtained from the Bank of America, and even more post-December 5th notes in the second delivery. In addition, most of the notes Rebozo returned for both deliveries that could be traced went to commercial banks in Las Vegas. Few went to Los Angeles commercial banks, and almost none went to the Bank of America. This withdrawal almost certainly could not have been the source of the first delivery, assuming the accuracy of Mayhew's and Rebozo's statements about keeping the money intact, because of the 50 consecutively numbered notes discussed earlier. Those 50 notes, identified by Rebozo as part of the first delivery, arrived in Las Vegas on the same day the Henley money was withdrawn from the bank in Los Angeles, and were not in circulation until the next day. Therefore, they could not have been part of the withdrawal in Los Angeles. Los Angeles, cash from the Bank of America, probably obtained June 27, 1969, sent to Robert Mayhew by Nadine Henley, receipt acknowledged by Mayhew on July 11, 1969. If this withdrawal was the source of the first delivery, there is no contradictory Federal Reserve evidence. The latest distribution date for notes returned and identified as the first delivery is June 12, 1969. If it was the source of the second delivery, however, a sizable proportion of the notes returned and identified as that delivery could not have been in commercial circulation until after the June 27 to July 11, 1969 period. This possible source suffers from the same problem of location as does the earlier Henley money discussed in 2 above. If a delivery originated at a Bank of America branch in Los Angeles, one would expect to find a significant number of notes in that delivery that were sent to that bank or at least 2 banks in Los Angeles. Such is not the case with the money Rebozo returned. In contrast, most of the notes that were traced went to commercial banks in Las Vegas. In addition, in the money returned and identified as the first delivery are 50 consecutively numbered $100 notes that were shipped together from the Los Angeles Federal Reserve to a Las Vegas commercial bank on December 4, 1968. If this June-July 1969 money was the source of the first delivery, and if Rebozo returned the same money he received, then those 50 bills had to stay together from December 4, 1968, and find their way to Los Angeles for withdrawal by Henley some 7 months later. Such a phenomenon seems unlikely. Taken together, the evidence either makes this source unlikely or indicates that the money returned and identified as the first delivery was not all the same money withdrawn by Henley in June 1969 and used for a delivery to Rebozo. Las Vegas, Silver Slipper Casino, October 26, 1970. This withdrawal is a source only for the possible second delivery on October 28 through 30, 1970, since all other possible delivery dates were before October 1970. None of the available Federal Reserve evidence contradicts the testimony on this date. The latest commercial circulation date on money Rebozo returned as the second delivery is October 1, 1970, for a note sent to a commercial bank in Chicago. 5. The facts compared with possible dates of delivery. The following is an analysis of possible combinations of delivery dates based upon Federal Reserve evidence. Although the reader's patience may be tested, the most comprehensible format is to analyze each possible combination of delivery dates in light of what the information obtained from the Federal Reserve shows. Rebozo and Danner have testified that one of the deliveries was in San Clemente on July 3, 1970. Consequently, to lend some coherence to the story, that date will be used throughout this analysis, sometimes as the first delivery, sometimes as the second. The evidence from the Federal Reserve contradicts Rebozo's testimony that the money he returned was the money he received for all possible combinations of delivery dates, save one. The only set of dates on which the Federal Reserve evidence does not contradict Rebozo's testimony is one of the variations under Section 7 below, and the evidence tends to suggest that that set of dates is less likely than several others. Further, as discussed in the preceding section on sources, both the early December 1968 sources, Nadine Henley and the Sands, do not support the testimony that the money was held intact from time of origin until its return in 1973. There are some 88 notes in the first delivery, and even more in the second, that were not in commercial circulation until after early December 1968. A. First delivery, Key Biscayne, April 2nd through 10th, 1969. Second delivery, San Clemente, July 3rd, 1970. Sources: 1. Sands Casino, early December 1968, for either delivery, or 2. Nadine Henley, December 5th and 6th, 1968, for either delivery, and 3. Nadine Henley, July 11th, 1969, for the second delivery. None of the participants has suggested the April 1969 period as a possible time of delivery, and Danner testified that his trip to Florida, which included a business visit to Nassau, could not have been the occasion for that delivery. If a delivery did occur at this time, Rebozo's testimony that he did not disturb the first delivery from time of receipt until June 1973 would be incorrect. There are some 50 notes in the money returned and identified as the first delivery that could not have been in commercial circulation until after April 2, 1969. In addition, the evidence on this pair of dates would contradict Rebozo's testimony that the money he received as the second delivery was the money he returned in June 1973, for there are 72 notes in the money returned and identified as the second delivery that could not have been in commercial circulation until after July 3, 1970. B. First delivery, Key Biscayne, June 26, 1969. Second delivery, San Clemente, July 3, 1970. Sources: 1. Sands, early December 1968, for either delivery, or 2. Nadine Henley, December 5th and 6th, 1968, for either delivery, and 3. Nadine Henley, July 11th, 1969, for the second delivery. The June 26 date has never been suggested by any of the parties as a possible delivery date, although Danner testified that he and Rebozo discussed campaign contributions about that time. If this combination is correct, the source for the first delivery would have to be one of the early December 1968 withdrawals, since the July 11th money came after June 26th. There are a number of notes in the money identified as the first delivery that were not in circulation until later dates, thus contradicting Rebozo's testimony. Rebozo's testimony would also be incorrect as to the second delivery for the same reason explained in Possibility 1 above, that is, that there are 72 bills in the money returned and identified as the second delivery that were not in circulation until after July 3, 1970. C. First delivery, Key Biscayne, September 11th and 12th, 1969. Second delivery, San Clemente, July 3rd, 1970. Sources: 1. Sands, early December 1968, for either delivery, or 2. Nadine Henley, December 5th and 6th, 1968, for either delivery, or 3. Nadine Henley, July 11th, 1969, for either delivery. This is a probable combination of dates, as discussed earlier. Rebozo's testimony reconciles for the first delivery only if the money for that delivery was the money Mayhew received on July 11, 1969. However, if the source were one of the early December 1968 withdrawals, the testimony would not stand up because a number of bills returned and identified as the first delivery were not in circulation until after early December 1968. In addition, as with possibilities 1 and 2, the Federal Reserve evidence on the money returned and identified as the second delivery contradicts Rebozo's testimony on the second delivery, because there are 72 notes in the money Rebozo returned and identified as the second delivery that were not in circulation until after July 3, 1970. D. First delivery, Key Biscayne, February 3 through 5, 1970. Second delivery, San Clemente, July 3, 1970. Sources: 1. Sands, early December 1968 for either delivery, or 2. Nadine Henley, December 5 and 6, 1968 for either delivery, or 3. Nadine Henley, July 1969 for either delivery. If this is the correct combination, Rebozo's testimony stands up for the first delivery if the money was put together on July 11, 1969, but not if it was put together in early December 1968, for the reasons listed in the preceding sections. Further, as with earlier possibilities 1, 2, and 3, the evidence on the money returned and identified as the second delivery contradicts Rebozo's testimony. E. First delivery, Key Biscayne, March 20th through 22nd, 1970. Second delivery, San Clemente, July 3rd, 1970. Sources: 1. Sands, December 5th, 1968 for either delivery, or 2. Nadine Henley, December 5th, 6th, 1968 for either delivery, or 3. Nadine Henley, July 11th, 1969 for either delivery. Again, Rebozo's testimony stands up for the first delivery only if it consisted of the money Mayhew received on July 11th, 1969. Similarly, as with the earlier discussions of July 3rd, the evidence on the money returned and identified as the second delivery contradicts Rebozo's testimony on the second delivery because of the 72 bills returned and identified as the second delivery that were not in circulation until after July 3rd. F. First delivery, San Clemente, July 3rd, 1970. Second delivery, Key Biscayne, August 19th, 20th, 1970. Sources: 1. Sands, December 5th, 1968 for either delivery, or 2. Nadine Henley, December 5th and 6th, 1968 for either delivery, or 3. Nadine Henley, July 11th, 1969 for either delivery. This is the first possible arrangement in which the first delivery is in San Clemente. Once again, Rebozo's testimony stands up for the first delivery only if the money delivered to Rebozo was the money Mayhew received in July 1969. In addition, if the second delivery was on August 19th and 20th, Rebozo's testimony could not be correct. There are 35 notes in the money he returned as the second delivery that were not available for commercial distribution until after August 20th, 1970. G. First delivery, San Clemente, July 3rd, 1970. Second delivery, Key Biscayne, October 28th to 30th, 1970. Sources: 1. Sands, December 5th, 1968 for first delivery, or 2. Nadine Henley, December 5th and 6th, 1968 for first delivery, and 3. Nadine Henley, July 11th, 1969 for first delivery, and 4. Silver Slipper, October 26, 1970 for second delivery. This is the only one of the 7 possible combinations under discussion that can conform to Rebozo's testimony that the money he returned was the exact money he received. Even this combination reconciles with his testimony only if Source 3, the July 11th, 1969 money from Henley, was the source of funds for the first delivery, and if Source 4, was the source of the funds for the second delivery. If the first delivery was put together from source 1 or 2, the general problem with these dates applies here. That is, there are 88 notes in the money returned and identified as the first delivery that were not available for commercial distribution until after the early December 1968 transactions. If the first delivery was put together on or about July 11, 1969, and delivered on July 3, 1970, Rebozo's testimony is not contradicted by the Federal Reserve records. If the second delivery was put together on October 26, 1970, Rebozo's testimony is not contradicted for that date. The latest date of commercial distribution available on the money returned and identified as the second delivery is October 1, 1970, for a note sent to a commercial bank in Chicago. End of Section 13. Recording by Maria Casper. Section 14 of the Watergate Report, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Final Report of the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities, Volume 3. Chapter 8, The Hughes-Rebozo Investigation and Related Matters, Part 7. 6. Dunes Report. Introduction. Howard Hughes was a significant contributor to President Nixon's 1972 campaign. Although other principals in the Hughes-Rebozo contribution have disputed him, Mr. Rebozo testified that the $100,000 in cash he received from an agent of Hughes was for President Nixon's 1972 campaign. In addition to the secret contribution to Mr. Rebozo, Hughes contributed some $150,000 directly to the Nixon re-election campaign. The Rosemary Woods list of pre-April 7, 1972 contributors shows a total of $50,000 from Mr. Hughes. The remaining $100,000 was contributed to various state finance committees to re-elect the president after April 7th, generally after the election, and duly recorded. Besides being a contributor to Nixon campaigns in 1968 and 1972, Mr. Hughes was also a man whose numerous business activities were under frequent government review. As part of its investigation of Hughes's contributions to the 1972 campaign, pursuant to Senate Resolution 60, the Select Committee investigated Hughes's relations with federal agencies from the date of the 1968 presidential election through 1972. The circumstances surrounding Hughes's efforts in 1970 to buy the Dunes Hotel in Las Vegas show questionable conduct at high levels of the executive branch and raise serious questions about the relation between campaign contributions by Hughes and federal actions affecting Hughes. The problems inherent in difficult-to-trace cash contributions are emphasized in the Dunes case, where Richard Danner, the man who delivered the Hughes cash to Charles G. Rebozo, the president's close friend, also presented Hughes's case on the hotel purchase directly to the Attorney General in a series of secret meetings. In early October 1973, the Select Committee staff began examining documents and interviewing the parties involved in the case. Over 50 interviews were conducted during the course of the investigation. The Antitrust Division of the Department of Justice cooperated freely and generously with the inquiry by providing copies of its files on the Dunes and the 2 other hotel cases involving Hughes, and by making staff lawyers available for interviews. A. Prior Antitrust Division review of Hughes's hotel activities, the Stardust and Landmark cases. Between early 1967 and early 1968, Howard Hughes bought 4 resort hotels in Las Vegas, as well as a substantial amount of land on the Strip. and there was a widespread suspicion that Hughes wanted to buy up all of Las Vegas. As shown in memorandums written to and by Hughes, Hughes was keenly interested in the hotel negotiations undertaken on his behalf by Robert Maheu, chief of Hughes's Nevada operations. Copies of some of the 1968 Hughes-Maheu memorandums, in which hotel purchases were discussed, have been obtained by the Select Committee. By March 1968, Hughes was actively pursuing several possible hotel purchases, including the Stardust in Las Vegas, and was concerned about whether the Senate Gaming Commission would approve any purchases he made. Hughes's interest in the financial details of the proposed purchases was typified in Maheu's March 6, 1968 memorandum to Hughes on the Stardust, and in Hughes's memorandum to Maheu of March 17, 1968, which set forth their evolving understanding of the proposed purchase terms. In a memorandum to Maheu dated March 14, 1968, Hughes explained his strategy for obtaining Gaming Commission approval of his proposed purchases, which essentially was to promise the Commission that the Stardust would be Hughes's last major hotel-casino acquisition in Las Vegas. The Dunes was apparently of interest to Hughes at this early date, but nothing happened until 1970. In early April 1968, the Antitrust Division of the Department of Justice, aware of Hughes's interest in the Stardust and other Las Vegas hotels, began a formal investigation or preliminary inquiry. The preliminary inquiry, which consisted of statistical research and analysis of the Las Vegas hotel industry and interviews of Hughes representatives, was conducted primarily by James J. Coelho, then a staff lawyer in the Antitrust Division's San Francisco office, and now chief of the Los Angeles office. As a result of his investigation, Coelho developed an expertise in the area of hotel acquisitions that was later used in evaluating other proposed purchases by Hughes, including the Dunes. In a mid-April memorandum, Richard Gray, a Hughes lawyer from Houston, told Hughes of a Justice Department request that the planned May 1st purchase of the Stardust and the Silver Slipper Casino, also in Las Vegas, be delayed until June 30th to give the Antitrust Division time to review the case. By April 20th, Hughes was apparently confident that the Justice Department review would present no problems, but he was wrong. Although the Nevada Gaming Commission approved Hughes's plan to buy the Stardust, the Justice Department inquiry led to a civil complaint, signed by the required Justice Department personnel, including Attorney General Ramsey Clark, and scheduled for filing in late June 1968. Faced with the prospect of a lawsuit, Hughes's representatives postponed the merger shortly before the complaint was to be filed. Consequently, the suit was not filed. Hughes did not try again to purchase the Stardust, although Hughes's representatives tried in vain to obtain a reversal of the department's position in the following months. The gist of the complaint was that adding the Stardust to Hughes's other hotel holdings would violate Section 7 of the Clayton Act by increasing his share of the relevant market, defined in the complaint as resort hotel rooms in Las Vegas, to almost 40%, well beyond the percentages allowed by leading antitrust cases and by the merger guidelines promulgated by the department on May 30, 1968, and hence to an unlawfully anti-competitive level. The proposed complaint and accompanying legal memorandum are important reference points for the later handling of the Dunes case by the Justice Department. In the fall of 1968, Hughes became seriously interested in buying the landmark hotel in Las Vegas, the then unfinished structure that was beset with substantial financial problems. Hughes's lawyer, Richard Gray, and lawyers for the owner submitted to the Antitrust Division a written request for advance approval, called a business review letter, contending that the landmark was a failing company that could only be saved from bankruptcy by Hughes's offer. The failing company doctrine is an explicit exception to the strictures of the merger guidelines. The procedures for processing and granting requests for business review letters are set forth in Antitrust Division regulations. The landmark file is extensive. As in the Stardust case, the proposed purchase was found to violate the merger guidelines. The Antitrust Division expressed to the buyer and seller serious doubts about whether the failing company defense, necessary to override a violation of the guidelines, had been adequately established, and demanded more proof. A full-scale investigation was launched by the Antitrust Division, including numerous interviews of possible alternative purchasers by Antitrust Division lawyers, particularly James Coelho, who had worked on the Stardust case. On January 17, 1969, the Antitrust Division formally approved the purchase in writing, having decided that an exception to antitrust rules was justified because no other alternative to bankruptcy existed besides Hughes. Hughes now owns the landmark. B. The Dunes. 1. How it began. Hughes's proposed purchase of the Dunes Hotel in Las Vegas was handled by Hughes's representatives and by the Justice Department very differently than were the Stardust and Landmark cases. In early 1970, Hughes instructed Robert Mayhew to negotiate to buy the Dunes. According to Mayhew, the instruction, like so many from Hughes, came without prior notice and with no explanation of Hughes's reasons. The Select Committee has discovered no Hughes-Mayhew memorandums covering the Dunes negotiations. Mayhew says that Hughes, with whom he was frequently in touch regarding the Dunes, instructed him to send Richard Danner, then manager of the Hughes-owned Frontier Hotel in Las Vegas, directly to John Mitchell to obtain Justice Department approval of the purchase. Mayhew stated that after being thwarted by the Antitrust Division in the Stardust case, Hughes decided that he would never again talk with any Assistant Attorneys General, but instead would deal only with the boss, that is, the Attorney General. Mayhew's explanation does not square with Hughes's approach to the Antitrust Division in the Landmark case, where, shortly after the Stardust confrontation, Mayhew and Richard Gray formally approached the Assistant Attorney General, Antitrust Division, with a written business review request. A more likely reason for sending Danner directly to Mitchell was that Danner knew Mitchell from the 1968 campaign. According to Robert Mayhew, Hughes, who had to pass upon the hiring of all top executives, was pleased with the hiring of Danner in early 1969 and was aware of Danner's political contacts. Hughes-Mayhew memorandums talked specifically about Danner being a liaison to the Nixon administration, and Hughes instructed Mayhew to supplement Danner's income some $10,000 to $12,000 per year to compensate him for his liaison activities. 2. The Mitchell-Danner meetings. John Mitchell's decision to approve the Dunes purchase apparently rested on a series of secret meetings between Mitchell and Danner in early 1970. The following summary is based upon interviews with Mitchell and Danner, Mitchell's logs, and Danner's expense records. Significantly, there is no record of the Danner-Mitchell meetings, which no one else attended, in the Dunes file maintained by the Antitrust Division. Further, none of the Antitrust Division lawyers who knew or might have known about the case had any recollection of meeting with Danner on the Dunes, and none of them ever learned of the Danner-Mitchell meetings. Danner, Rebozo, and Mitchell have denied that there was any connection between the discussions regarding the Dunes and the Hughes contribution to Rebozo. Mitchell said that his first knowledge of the Hughes contributions to Rebozo came from newspaper reports, not from Danner, Rebozo, or anyone else involved in the transaction. Danner testified that he and Mitchell did not discuss political contributions or the 1972 presidential campaign, and could not recall discussing the Dunes with Rebozo. Mr. Rebozo testified that he never talked with Danner about the dunes or with Mitchell about any problems related to Hughes. A. Danner's testimony. Mitchell was aware that Danner was working in Las Vegas for Hughes. He called Danner in late 1969 and asked to see him when Danner was next in Washington. On his next trip, date uncertain, Danner saw Mitchell and discussed a Justice Department strike force being set up to combat organized crime in Las Vegas. Mitchell was doubtful that Hughes's control over the casinos affected the influence exerted by organized crime in Las Vegas. At Danner's suggestion, the Attorney General sent a strike force into the Frontier Hotel to review its operations. Danner testified that a strike force was sent and that it determined that the operation of the casino was not under mob influence. The Select Committee found no evidence that any Justice Department lawyer was sent to the Frontier Hotel for such a purpose, or that anybody in the Justice Department ever approved the Hughes operation at the Frontier. One Justice Department lawyer did visit the Frontier in early 1970. David Nissen, who was an assistant U.S. attorney in Los Angeles in 1970, visited the Frontier on either January 21, 1970 or March 9, 1970, solely to examine records from the pre-Hughes days, then in the custody of Hughes employees, that were relevant to a case in Los Angeles. Nissen never discussed the merits of Hughes's operation with Hughes's personnel or with anyone in the Department of Justice, including John Mitchell. Danner's first meeting with Attorney General Mitchell regarding the acquisition of the dunes was in January 1970. Danner has stated, "At about that time, the acquisition of the Dunes Hotel had come up. The Dunes was for sale. I was asked by Robert Mayhew to talk to the Attorney General and ascertain what the guidelines might be, now or then at the time, relative to whether or not we would be in violation of antitrust, bearing in mind that at a former time when they, the Hughes organization, were negotiating for the purpose of purchasing the Stardust Hotel, the Justice Department had threatened an antitrust suit if they took it." Danner testified that Mitchell asked him to get all the figures on the hotel rooms in the state of Nevada and those owned by Mr. Hughes. Mitchell told Danner he was unfamiliar with the department's earlier position on Hughes's proposed hotel purchases, so Danner briefed him. Danner met again with Mitchell regarding the dunes on February 26, 1970. Danner brought with him what he remembers as a one-page statistical memorandum showing the total number of hotel rooms, total number of motel rooms, total number of rooms in Hughes's hotels, and any percentage. When questioned by the Select Committee, Danner thought the memorandum had been prepared by Al Benedict, then an aide of Mayhew's. However, the memorandum was prepared by Edward P. Morgan, a Washington lawyer who then represented Hughes and had represented the owners of the Stardust during the 1968 negotiations with Hughes. The 5-page memorandum, 2 of text, 3 of statistics, which was observed in the official Dunes file provided by the Antitrust Division, was undated and unidentified as to source or recipient. Further, there is no indication of how or when it was put into that file. The copy provided to the Select Committee by Morgan was attached to a cover letter from Morgan to Robert Mayhew, written on February 27, 1970, one day after what the letter refers to as the Danner-Mitchell Conference. Interestingly, none of the Antitrust Division lawyers who worked on or theoretically had jurisdiction over the case, including then Assistant Attorney General Richard McLaren, remembers seeing this memorandum. The lack of a stamped date of receipt on the copy in the Dunes file indicates that the memorandum was hand-delivered to the department and placed directly into the file, not routed through the mailroom. A memorandum setting forth similar statistics and arguments was submitted to the Antitrust Division on Hughes's behalf by Edward Morgan during the Landmark case. The date of receipt, origin of the memo, and official reaction to it are noted in handwritten comments on the memorandum made by an Antitrust Division lawyer, unlike the Dunes memorandum submitted by Morgan. The memorandum submitted to Mitchell by Danner in effect argues for two changes in the market definition used by the Antitrust Division in the Stardust and Landmark cases. First, instead of defining the market as resort hotel rooms in Las Vegas, the Antitrust Division should instead consider all guest rooms, that is, all hotel and motel rooms in Las Vegas, or, secondly, all guest rooms in the entire state of Nevada. According to the unsubstantiated figures in the Danner memorandum, Hughes's purchase of the Dunes would not have violated the merger guidelines if one of the alternative market definitions were used. There is nothing in the Justice Department Dunes file to indicate that any analysis was done on the memorandum delivered by Danner. Both James Coyle and Badia Rashid, Director of Operations in the Antitrust Division, have noted that such a significant policy change should not have been made without an extensive analysis by lawyers in the division. Upon receipt of the memorandum on February 26th, Mitchell told Danner, according to Danner's testimony, that he would let the boys look this over and give you an answer later. The only substantive discussion during the meeting apparently concerned the statistical information Danner had provided. Danner testified that the question whether the Dunes was being managed by criminal elements was not discussed. Mitchell promised to get in touch with Danner about the Dunes, which he did when he asked Danner in a telephone conversation to see him the next time Danner was in Washington. That conversation was probably on March 9, 1970. Danner came to Washington and met with Mitchell on March 19, 1970. Danner recalled the conversation as follows: "I went by his office. I cannot recall whether there was anybody else present, whether he called anyone up to meet with me, but in a very perfunctory manner he said, 'From our review of these figures we see no problem. Why don't you go ahead with the negotiations?'" During the same conversation, Danner testified that Mitchell told him proposed purchase met the guidelines, the merger guidelines. Danner testified that he could not recall Mitchell showing him, during the March 19th meeting, any documents reflecting an analysis of the proposed purchase by Justice Department lawyers. In addition, Mitchell did not mention anything about removing organized crime from the Dunes, or say that the decision had anything to do with that consideration. Danner has no recollection that anyone else was involved in his conversations with Mitchell about the Dunes. Immediately after the meeting with Mitchell, Danner reported the favorable result to Robert Maheu and Edward P. Morgan. Although neither man can remember how or where the message was delivered, both Danner and Maheu were registered at the Madison Hotel on March 19, 1970. Maheu remembers Danner telling him that the case was taken care of in Washington and that there would be no interference beyond that. After Danner met with Mitchell and reported to Maheu, he flew to Florida for the weekend. Maheu does not remember being in Florida then, but records from the Sonesta Beach Hotel in Key Biscayne show Danner and Maheu registered there from March 20th through 22nd, 1970. On March 20th, 1970, at 3:30 p.m., Mitchell left Union Station in Washington on a train trip to Florida. Mitchell returned to Washington on the evening of March 23rd. At noon on the next day, he went back to Key Biscayne, in the words of his log. Thus, he was apparently in Key Biscayne when Danner and Maheu were. President Nixon was not in Key Biscayne during this time period. Danner asserts that he did not discuss the Dunes with Rebozo during March 20th through 22nd, 1970, despite the just-completed meeting with Mitchell, or at any other time. Danner does not remember whether he saw Mitchell in Key Biscayne over this March weekend. Mr. Rebozo also denies any discussion of the dunes with Danner. Mayhew, on the other hand, has raised the distinct possibility of a quid pro quo arrangement. On July 4, 1973, Mayhew testified that after Danner returned from one of his meetings with Mitchell in Washington, Mayhew set in motion one of the two $50,000 contributions to Rebozo. According to Mayhew, "I believe I informed Mr. Bell," Tom Bell, then a Hughes lawyer in Las Vegas, in the presence of Mr. Danner, upon the return of Mr. Danner from Washington, D.C., that certain political obligations had to be met as the result of the trip which Mr. Danner had made. I believe I requested that Mr. Bell make those funds available to Mr. Danner. The recollections of Danner and Bell on this subject are set forth in the section on the deliveries of the $100,000. While uncertain about Danner's talks with Mitchell, Mayhew is certain that he commented about the $50,000 in conversations with Danner about the Dunes Hotel. When telling Danner that Hughes wanted to see Mitchell about the antitrust problems relative to the acquisition of the Dunes, Mayhew noted, "I remember telling Danner that we had authority from Hughes to make a commitment to help the administration in some of the congressional races they'd be interested in, but I don't know to this day if he took the matter up with Mitchell or someone else." After one of Danner's trips to Washington to see Mitchell, he and Mayhew, according to Mayhew, talked about a planned delivery to Rebozo. B. Mitchell's statement. Mitchell remembers only one meeting with Danner and with Antitrust Division officials, sometime in the summer of 1970. Mitchell claims that the Antitrust Division preferred to have public corporations rather than criminal figures owning hotels. The question on the Dunes, however, was not one of criminal influences, but rather whether the market definition should be Las Vegas hotels or hotels throughout Nevada. Mitchell cannot remember whether he or anyone in the department ever made a decision on the Dunes. In general, Mitchell says he remembers almost nothing about the Dunes. There is nothing in the Dunes file written by Mitchell or indicating in any way his opinion on the case. 3. What happened in the Antitrust Division? In early March 1970, Mitchell called Richard McLaren, then head of the Antitrust Division. According to McLaren, Mitchell emphasized that the governor of Nevada was pushing for justice approval of the Dunes purchase by indicating that the Dunes was hoodlum-owned and that Hughes would buy it and clean it up. Mitchell told McLaren that he was inclined to go along with the purchase and asked McLaren to determine if Hughes could buy the Dunes without doing too much violence to the merger guidelines. McLaren interpreted this as a casual inquiry. Soon after the call from Mitchell, Mitchell and McLaren met with James Coelho, who had developed a knowledge of the Las Vegas hotel situation in his work on the Stardust and Landmark cases. Coelho was in Washington working on the ITT case. McLaren's memory of his conversation with Coelho is vague. In fact, until reminded of it during his interview, he could not remember meeting with Coelho. He thought he had called Coelho at Coelho's California office. Coelho's recollection is much clearer. According to Coelho, McLaren told him that he, McLaren, might have to approve the Dunes purchase. This was the first time Coelho had heard of the possibility. McLaren told Coelho that the governor of Nevada was putting pressure on for approval by arguing that Hughes would drive the mafia from the Dunes, and he asked Coelho for his opinion of the purchase. Coelho remembered saying that approval could not be reconciled with the department's 1968 position on the Stardust, and that the job of controlling crime should be handled by the Nevada authorities, not by making exceptions to antitrust policies. Coelho offered to write a memorandum for McLaren based upon market shares and the merger guidelines, and upon his recollection of the pertinent facts in the Stardust and Landmark cases. McLaren accepted the offer. Coelho wrote a 5-page memorandum and gave it to McLaren's secretary on March 6, 1970, just before he returned to California. He had no other involvement in the Dunes case, and hearing nothing about it, he assumed that McLaren had been able to kill the idea of a Hughes purchase. The Coelho memorandum, after outlining the Stardust and Landmark cases, pointed out that the proposed purchase would increase Hughes's share of the Las Vegas resort hotel market to about 28%. Coelho also noted that the proposed acquisition is bound to create controversy, and that because of prior involvement with Hughes's hotel purchases, the Antitrust Division will be asked to take a position. The memorandum concluded on an equivocal note, with Coelho suggesting a possible alternative to outright approval. If there are overriding considerations which make it necessary to modify our prior position on Hughes's acquisitions in Las Vegas, we should tie that acquisition to the changing and unsettled market structure, as suggested by Parvin Dorman, another hotel case, and preserve our right to secure divestiture at a later date if it becomes necessary. On March 8, 1970, a Sunday, McLaren worked on the Dunes matter in his office for 1/2 hour, presumably evaluating Coelho's memorandum. 4 days later, on March 12, 1970, McLaren and Mitchell met at 5 p.m. and discussed the Dunes for approximately 15 minutes. McLaren told Mitchell that the purchase would violate the merger guidelines and would make the department look bad because of its prior position on the Stardust. McLaren also suggested that Nevada could act on its own against criminal figures running casinos by instituting license revocation proceedings. McLaren told Mitchell that the Antitrust Division would accept the Hughes purchase if there were no other legitimate and reasonable bids. According to McLaren, my remarks did not express and were not intended by me to express my approval, nor to substitute for the formal investigation and report procedure which precede division action on acquisitions of this kind. The meeting concluded without Mitchell indicating what his reaction to McLaren's presentation was or what his position on the purchase would be. This was the last discussion on the subject McLaren remembers having with Mitchell. Danner testified that on March 19th, as noted earlier, Mitchell conveyed oral approval of the proposed purchase to Danner. McLaren says that he never met Danner or any Hughes people, that he knows of no Mitchell meetings with Hughes's representatives, and that he knows of no approval given to Hughes by Mitchell. On March 26th, unaware that Mitchell had given oral approval to Danner 1 week earlier, McLaren wrote a 2-page memorandum to Mitchell reviewing their early March phone conversation and their March 12th meeting. McLaren, however, did not recall any discussions with Mitchell about the case after March 26, 1970. With one possible exception, no one in the Antitrust Division remembers seeing McLaren's March 26th memorandum or talking with McLaren about it. McLaren insists that in his March 26th memorandum, as in his March 12th meeting with Mitchell, he in no way intended to approve the proposed Dunes purchase or to relinquish his control of any future investigation if what McLaren saw as a casual inquiry turned into serious negotiations for the sale. End of Section 14. Recording by Maria Casper. Section 15 of the Watergate Report, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Final Report of the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities, Volume 3. Chapter 8. The Hughes-Rebozo Investigation and Related Matters, Part 8. 4. The FBI's Role. McLaren's March 26th memorandum was prompted by a March 23rd memorandum written to him by FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, with copies to no one else. According to the memorandum, on March 19th, the day Mitchell gave the go-ahead to Danner, someone representing Hughes told a Dunes representative that the Antitrust Division would not object to the purchase. Because McLaren had not given his approval, he wrote the memorandum to Mitchell so that Mitchell could clarify any misimpressions he might have had. It was McLaren's impression that Mitchell had talked with the governor of Nevada about the Dunes, an impression traced back to what Mitchell told him in their first conversation in early March, and that the governor had in turn talked to representatives of Hughes, who in turn had approached the Dunes. The end result of this chain was the clearly erroneous impression, held by the Hughes and Dunes representatives, that the Antitrust Division had approved the purchase. McLaren attached the March 23rd Hoover memorandum to his memorandum to Mitchell and concluded the memorandum as follows: I trust that the attached FBI report inaccurately records the understanding which the state government received from the department. Unfortunately, the FBI has been unable to provide further explanation of the Hoover memorandum and any interest it may have had in the Dunes. There are no FBI memorandums in either the Stardust file or the Landmark file. One Antitrust Division official has stated that this kind of apparently self-initiated FBI involvement in an antitrust case is unusual. Another Antitrust Division official said that a memorandum directly to the Assistant Attorney General from the FBI Director was unusual. Hughes and his representatives were interested in enlisting FBI support for Hughes's hotel purchases, at least as far back as the time of the Stardust. In a February 12, 1968 memorandum to Mayhew, Hughes urged Mayhew to meet with Dean Elson, then head of the Las Vegas FBI office and later a Hughes employee, and George Dickerson, chairman of the Nevada Gaming Commission, to convince Dickerson that Hughes ought to be allowed to buy the Stardust because he would drive out criminal elements. James Coelho, in one of his Stardust memorandums dated April 26, 1968, reported that the FBI was pleased to see Hughes enter the Las Vegas hotel market. Harold Campbell, who headed the Las Vegas FBI office at the time of the attempted acquisition of the Dunes, said that he may have written one memorandum to Washington on a report he received sometime after the Dunes negotiations terminated that the negotiations had taken place, but he did not remember hearing about any Antitrust Division interest in the case. 5. The anti-crime factor in the Dunes decision. As the preceding discussion showed, John Mitchell told his Antitrust Division chief, Richard McLaren, that he, Mitchell, wanted to approve Hughes's plan to buy the Dunes because Hughes would drive out criminal elements present there. Mitchell told McLaren that the governor of Nevada was pushing for approval of the purchase on this anti-crime grounds, and McLaren relayed that information to Coelho. When talking with Danner about the Dunes, however, Mitchell never mentioned the anti-crime argument or the governor of Nevada, and Danner never approached Mitchell from that angle. According to Danner, he simply gave Mitchell a statistical memorandum on hotel rooms in Nevada, a memorandum recalled by neither McLaren nor any other Antitrust Division lawyers who should have or might have seen and evaluated it. According to Danner, the only Danner-Mitchell discussion regarding criminal elements in Las Vegas hotels
was the discussion they had in late 1969 about the Frontier Hotel. In an attempt to determine where Mitchell got the information he conveyed to McLaren in early March 1970, and whether it was correct and relevant to the approval he gave Danner, the Select Committee conducted numerous interviews. Paul Laxalt was governor of Nevada at the time of the dunes, and according to McLaren, the source of pro-Hughes pressure for approval of the dunes acquisition. He was interviewed twice and later submitted an affidavit to the Select Committee. His statements flatly contradict every aspect of Mitchell's apparent assertion to McLaren that Laxalt was promoting Hughes. Laxalt had supported Hughes in his early hotel purchases in Las Vegas, but the dunes presented a different case. In his affidavit to the Select Committee, Laxalt denied discussing the dunes with any officials in Washington, stated that he would have opposed Hughes's plan if he had heard about it, because Hughes had reached his limit of gaming licenses in southern Nevada, and indicated that the dunes was, in his opinion, a well-operated hotel free of any problems. Laxalt's position was supported by Frank Johnson, who at the time of the attempted acquisition of the dunes was chairman of the Nevada Gaming Policy Board, the investigative arm of the Gaming Commission. He, too, never heard about the dunes plan and would have opposed it. Thinking that Mitchell might have been getting the anti-crime argument he used with McLaren from within the Justice Department, the Select Committee interviewed numerous Justice Department lawyers to determine what, if any, feeling there might have been in the department that a Hughes purchase of the dunes in 1970 would have been desirable. None of these men was aware of any Hughes interest in buying the dunes during 1970 or talked with Mitchell about the matter. As a result, the source of John Mitchell's argument for approving the Hughes purchase that he conveyed to McLaren has not been determined. Hughes's representatives had made the anti-crime argument in 1968 at the time of the Stardust case. There was some discussion between Edwin Zimmerman, Assistant Attorney General, Antitrust Division, and Fred Vinson, Jr., Assistant Attorney General, Criminal Division, about Hughes's plan to buy the Stardust, with Vinson deferring to the Antitrust Division, but seeing merit in Hughes's argument. The anti-hoodlum argument was rejected by the Antitrust Division. 6. What happened after the March 26 memorandum? McLaren said that after March 26 he heard nothing about the dunes from Mitchell or anyone else, and talked with no one about the case until late in November, discussed below. However, Walker B. Comegys, McLaren's deputy, had a different recollection. He distinctly remembered McLaren stopping by his office just before McLaren left Washington on a trip. McLaren told Comegys, according to Comegys, that Mitchell had decided not to oppose Hughes's plan to buy the dunes because all other potential purchasers had mafia connections. This was the first and only time Comegys heard any concern about the dunes within the Justice Department. According to McLaren's logs, he left for Europe on May 21, 1970. McLaren, emphasizing that he cannot remember Mitchell telling him he had approved the dunes purchases, was willing to accept Comegys' recollection and said he would be terribly surprised if Mitchell granted approval without consulting him, since, as far as he knew, Mitchell never double-crossed him. Although Mitchell's log for May 21 shows no call to or from Danner, Danner's telephone records show a call to the Justice Department on May 21. Danner recalled only that the negotiations fell through sometime after March 19, but it is possible that he called Mitchell on May 21, as the Hughes-Dunes negotiations were apparently nearing completion, and thus prompted a Mitchell-McLaren conversation and McLaren's apparent conversation with Comegys. This chain of events is speculative, of course, but it may provide an explanation of the otherwise coincidental Danner call and McLaren comment, both on May 21st. At 5:05 p.m. on Friday, May 22nd, Comegys received a phone call from Howard Adler, a Washington lawyer who was calling on behalf of lawyers for the Rapid American Corporation, which, like Hughes, was then negotiating a possible purchase of the dunes. As Comegys recalls the conversation, Adler, whom Comegys knew, told him that the people he was calling for represented another potential buyer of the dunes who had no mafia connections. Comegys told Adler he had gotten the message. Comegys made no comment to Adler on the Antitrust Division's position. Comegys did not remember whether he reported this call to anyone in the Antitrust Division, to Mitchell or to McLaren when he returned from Europe in early June. Mitchell's log shows a conversation with Comegys at 12:15 p.m. on March 22nd, before Adler called, and both Mitchell's and Comegys' logs show a telephone conversation between them on May 26th, the next business day after May 22nd. The Adler to Comegys call came about as follows. Les Jacobson, a New York lawyer for Rapid American and partner in Fried, Frank, Harris, Shriver, and Jacobson, who was in Las Vegas negotiating with Dunes representatives, learned that Hughes was also interested in buying the hotel. Jacobson remembered that Hughes had had antitrust problems with his Las Vegas hotel interests in the past and wanted to make the Antitrust Division aware of another purchaser. Jacobson called Milton Eisenberg in the firm's Washington office, and because he knew that Adler, who had been in the Antitrust Division, would know whom to call. Adler was not in the same firm as Jacobson and Eisenberg. Adler told Comegys that he hoped the Antitrust Division would consider not only antitrust questions on the dunes, but would also look to the question of criminal influences in Las Vegas hotels. Neither Jacobson nor Aronson remembered saying anything about the anti-mafia argument. The Select Committee discovered no direct link between the May 22nd Adler to Comegys call and the May 22nd letter described below. On May 22, 1970, as the Hughes-Dunes negotiations appeared to be nearing agreement, James Hayes, a New York City lawyer, partner in Donovan, Leisure, Newton, and Irvine, representing Hughes on the TWA versus Hughes case, wrote a letter to the presiding federal judge, Honorable John Metzner of the Southern District of New York, informing the judge that Hughes was about to buy the dunes for $35 million in cash, and that the Attorney General had approved the purchase. Hughes had recently lost a large monetary judgment in the district court and was before Judge Metzner on the question of how large the supersedeas bond should be for appeal. The judge was concerned that Hughes was tying up too many of his assets in non-liquid items, which could present problems of liquidity if the judgment against Hughes were upheld on appeal. Mayhew remembered telling Hayes at Hughes's request to write the letter, but he did not remember telling Hayes that Mitchell had approved the deal. Edward P. Morgan, who was in Las Vegas with Mayhew on May 22nd negotiating the deal for Hughes, remembered talking with Hughes's lawyer Chester Davis after Mayhew brought him into a Mayhew-Davis telephone call. Morgan told Davis that the deal was on the verge of final agreement. Davis told Morgan that he needed the information for Judge Metzner. Morgan assumed that Danner relayed the information from Mitchell to Hayes. Richard McLaren was unaware of the letter until apprised of it by the Select Committee staff. Based upon the integrity and reputation of Hayes and his firm, McLaren was sure that Hayes would not have written the letter without receiving assurances that Mitchell had approved the deal. 7. The negotiations and their collapse. Shortly after Danner received approval from Mitchell and gave the news to Mayhew, Mayhew, as always at Hughes's request, called Edward P. Morgan and told him to begin negotiations with representatives of the Dunes. Morgan described the call this way: "I got a call from Mr. Mayhew saying that Mr. Hughes was most interested in acquiring the Dunes Hotel, and I remember my reaction was, in effect, how the hell does he expect to do this when he was turned down on the Stardust deal by the Antitrust Division, and in the intervening period had acquired the landmark under an exception. And then I learned, as I had learned in other areas, that mine was not to know the reason why, that Mr. Hughes wanted it done." Mayhew assured Morgan that Hughes was satisfied there would be no Justice Department objections. Morgan, assisted by Tom Bell, Hughes's personal lawyer in Las Vegas, negotiated with Morris Schenker, the St. Louis lawyer who represented the Dunes, and Sidney Wyman, casino manager at the Dunes. Schenker provided the Select Committee with documentation on the negotiations. The deal fell through in late May 1970. The course of the negotiations themselves is unimportant, but several points are noteworthy. All participants agreed that financial considerations alone led to the break-off of negotiations in late May 1970, shortly after the May 22 letter was sent to Judge Metzner. Schenker produced updated profit and loss figures on the Dunes, which showed a substantial loss for the preceding months due to a loss of business during remodeling and an employees' strike. Antitrust considerations played no part in the termination. In fact, Schenker and Wyman did not remember questions about the Justice Department's antitrust policy ever arising during the negotiations. Morgan remembered Schenker once asking him if there would be any antitrust problems. Morgan told him that he, Morgan, had been assured there were none. On November 24, 1970, some 7 months after the negotiations between Hughes and the Dunes broke off, J. Edgar Hoover wrote a still unexplained memorandum to the Attorney General, with copies to the Deputy Attorney General Richard Kleindienst and McLaren. Hoover reported that Hughes had renewed his interest in the Dunes and that Edward P. Morgan was implying to someone that the Antitrust Division would not object to the purchase. The late date of this memorandum makes no sense in terms of the statements and documentation the Select Committee has been given. Because the FBI provided no further evaluation, the basis of this memorandum is still unexplained. McLaren remembered receiving a copy of the memorandum, which to him did not constitute firm enough information to warrant initiating a preliminary inquiry. McLaren did write a note to Badia Rashid, Director of Operations, when he received the Hoover memorandum. He asked Rashid which individual had worked on Las Vegas hotels earlier, saying that McLaren wanted to talk with him. It is not clear whether Rashid ever received the memorandum. Note that his name is crossed out and replaced by the word file in McLaren's handwriting. Rashid remembered telling McLaren that Coelho was the Las Vegas hotel expert. Having learned that, McLaren apparently did nothing. Neither he nor Coelho remembered discussing this second Hoover memorandum. Coelho remembered seeing the memorandum, the original of which was for some unexplained reason sent to California and routed to Coelho. That was presumably Mitchell's copy. The memorandum may have been, in the juxtaposition of the following 2 paragraphs, Hoover's oblique way of asking Mitchell why there had been a change in the department's position since the Stardust case. It was reported that Morgan has strongly implied that there will be no objection from the Antitrust Division of the Department of Justice concerning Hughes's efforts to purchase another Las Vegas casino. As you will recall, the Antitrust Division objected to Hughes's attempt to purchase the Stardust Hotel Casino in Las Vegas in 1968. Edward P. Morgan, Robert Mayhew, and E. Parry Thomas, the Las Vegas banker mentioned in the Hoover Memorandum, denied that, as reported in the memorandum, they visited the SEC as a group to seek approval for a cash purchase of the dunes by Hughes. C. Conclusion. In contrast to the immediately preceding case involving Hughes's hotel plans, the Landmark, the initial approach to the Justice Department on the dunes was made directly to the Attorney General, not to the Antitrust Division. It was made by Richard Danner, the courier of $100,000 to Rebozo, who was also a friend of Rebozo, Mitchell, and President Nixon. Although Danner and Mitchell contend that their discussions concerned antitrust questions regarding the hotel market in Las Vegas, Mitchell apparently did not invite his antitrust chief, Richard McLaren, to any of the meetings with Danner, advise him of the meetings, or submit Danner's statistical memorandum to the Antitrust Division for analysis. In fact, the Danner-Mitchell meetings were kept so secret that McLaren wrote his one memorandum to Mitchell on the dunes 1 week after Mitchell gave Danner approval of the purchase. As the evidence demonstrates, the apparent decision by Mitchell to approve the dunes purchase is clothed with the appearance of impropriety. 1. Secret meetings were held in lieu of the existing procedures for providing an appropriate antitrust analysis. 2. An ad hoc decision was made by the Attorney General which reversed the position of the professionals in the Antitrust Division, a position based upon considerable study and statistical analysis. And 3. Except for the fact that the purchase negotiations ultimately fell through for financial reasons wholly unrelated to antitrust considerations, this is a classic case of governmental decision-making for friends. 7. Rebozo's 1972 campaign fundraising role. On December 20, 1973, Charles G. Rebozo testified in a civil deposition as follows: "I am not a fundraiser. I never have been." However, evidence before the Select Committee indicates that 1. Rebozo solicited funds at the request of President Nixon. 2. Rebozo opened and maintained an account at the Key Biscayne Bank and Trust Company for the retention of 1972 campaign funds. 3. Rebozo used his personal safe deposit box at the Key Biscayne Bank and Trust Company to store cash campaign contributions for the 1972 campaign. 4. Rebozo was aware of other in-kind contributions and cash contributions. 5. Rebozo personally handled at least $190,000 in campaign contributions for the 1972 presidential campaign. Rebozo's discussions with Richard Danner about a cash contribution from Howard Hughes began shortly after the 1968 election. In addition, a memorandum from early 1969 states that Haldeman informed Ehrlichman that President Nixon asked Rebozo to contact J.P. Getty for purposes of soliciting major contributions to be controlled by the White House. Edward L. Morgan has said that he was approached by John Ehrlichman in the spring of 1969 with the question of the legality of such a contribution from J.P. Getty. Mr. Rebozo testified that he contacted Mr. Getty and arranged an appointment for Herbert Kalmbach to solicit contributions at Mr. Kalmbach's request. On March 21, 1974, Herbert Kalmbach testified that Rebozo had asked him to solicit funds from Mr. Getty for the 1970 senatorial campaign program. Public documents from the Committee to Re-elect the President reflect a contribution to the 1972 campaign of $125,000 by Mr. Getty. Mr. Rebozo testified that he also arranged an appointment for Kalmbach with Mr. Raymond Guest to solicit contributions. public records reveal a $200,000 contribution by Guest to the 1972 campaign to re-elect the president. On April 5, 1972, Mr. Rebozo opened an account at the Key Biscayne Bank and Trust Company entitled the Committee for the Re-election of the President account for the purpose of retaining 1972 campaign contributions. Rebozo stated that he opened the account to beat the April 6 deadline with respect to a $10,000 contribution which had been made. On April 6, 1972, Rebozo deposited $10,000 in the account, which was later wired the same day to the Finance Committee to Re-elect the President's account at the First National Bank of Washington, D.C. The source of this contribution was Atlantic Investors of Miami Limited, partnership of J. Kislak and Alec Cortellis. Rebozo's campaign account in the Key Biscayne Bank and Trust Company also served as a repository after April 7, 1972, for $29,740 in other campaign contributions. These contributions were finally transferred to the Finance Committee's main account in Washington, D.C. on April 2, 1973. Rebozo was the recipient of each of these contributions that were forwarded to Washington, and he acknowledged the receipt of each contribution with a personal note. Rebozo, however, did not forward to the campaign committee any portion of the $100,000 cash contribution from Howard Hughes. On December 20, 1973, Rebozo testified that he did not receive any other pre-April 7 campaign contributions besides the Hughes and Kislak contributions and others that are reported. However, only when 6 months later he was asked specifically about a contribution from A.D. Davis did Rebozo acknowledge receipt of a $50,000 cash contribution from the Davis brothers on April 4 or 5, 1972. This contribution from A.D. Davis and J.E. Davis was not reported in any records of the Finance Committee to Re-elect the President, nor was it deposited in the account Rebozo established for 1972 contributions. Mr. A.D. Davis subsequently testified that he delivered $50,000 in $100 bills to Rebozo on April 5, 1972, which was intended only for President Nixon's 1972 re-election campaign. Davis also testified he and Rebozo discussed the importance of the April 7th date, and that Rebozo indicated to him that he would speak to the President about this contribution. Rebozo testified that he received the contribution from Davis, called the Finance Committee office in Washington, D.C., and that the Finance Committee dispatched Fred LaRue to Miami to pick up the contribution. In fact, LaRue testified that he did not discuss nor receive any campaign contributions from Rebozo until October 1972, a full 6 months after the Davis contribution was received. LaRue testified that he was contacted by Mr. John Kerr of the Nunn for Senate campaign in Kentucky in September 1972 concerning the possibility of sending additional funds from the Committee to Re-elect the President to the Nunn campaign. Mr. Kerr, however, denies any such request was made by him. LaRue testified he subsequently discussed the subject with former Attorney General John Mitchell, who had initially committed support to the Nunn campaign. LaRue testified that Mitchell suggested that he contact Rebozo for possible funds. When LaRue called him, Rebozo told LaRue that the funds were immediately available, and LaRue arranged to pick them up on his way back to Washington from his home in Jackson, Mississippi. LaRue's travel vouchers from CRP indicate that his trip from Jackson to Miami to pick up the cash did not occur until October 12, 1972. Finally, a letter dated October 13, 1972, from Maurice Stans to Mr. A.D. Davis states, Through Bibi Rebozo, I learned of the encouragement that you have indicated for this year's election. The letter makes no reference to any contribution from Mr. Davis. LaRue testified that he picked up an envelope containing cash on that date from Rebozo, and that he probably told Rebozo that the money would go to a senatorial campaign without specifying which one. LaRue said in an interview on October 9, 1974, that he received about $25,000 to $30,000 from Rebozo in October. However, in subsequent sworn testimony, LaRue could not rule out the possibility that he received as much or more than $50,000 from Rebozo. However, the date on which LaRue picked the money up from Rebozo was more than 6 months after Rebozo received the cash contribution from A.D. Davis, and Rebozo did not tell LaRue that the money he gave him was a contribution from A.D. Davis to the president's campaign. Further, there are no records of the contribution in Rebozo's campaign account. LaRue testified that he returned to Washington, D.C. with the cash and commingled it with the cash already in his file cabinet, which was being used to pay the Watergate defendants. LaRue testified that subsequently a courier for the Nunn campaign picked up a sum of cash of about the same amount that he had picked up from Rebozo during this campaign period in 1972. The Nunn campaign, however, denies receiving any such cash. Several issues remain unresolved concerning the Davis contribution and related events. Furthermore, Mr. Rebozo refused to appear on June 26, 1974, pursuant to a subpoena and letter dated June 21, 1974, from Chairman Ervin, to clarify the record concerning these and other issues. Major outstanding issues therefore remain. 1. Why Mr. Rebozo failed to deposit the Davis contribution in the bank account opened expressly for the purpose of receiving pre-April 7th contributions. 2. When, if ever, did Rebozo notify the Finance Committee concerning his receipt of the Davis contribution? 3. Where did Rebozo store the cash in the period of time between the receipt of the money from Davis and his payment of the funds to LaRue? 4. Were the funds that were turned over to LaRue in the same amount and the original bills given to Rebozo by A.D. Davis? 5. Were any funds furnished by Rebozo to LaRue paid to Watergate defendants, and did Rebozo have any knowledge of that? End of section 15. Recording by Maria Casper.